you're exposed to certain kinds of people and not other kinds of people, then of course, I think most of you know that your ability to discriminate among the people you're familiar with is much better than for other populations. But if you then take a trip to a new country, then without any supervision, you immediately start getting better at discriminating amongst people from this new place. So for example, in like 2008, I went to Senegal, and I really didn't know how to tell the difference between various types of people that live in Senegal, and after 2 weeks, I could easily recognize the difference between Wolof and Mende and Mandinka and Serer people without anybody having really helped me to do that. And so I would really like to see algorithms, and of course I wasn't carrying a giant bag of all the faces I'd ever seen. I did not have my original training data with me. So I would like to be able to take a face recognition algorithm that's never been exposed to a certain kind of data, and with only unlabeled examples of a new population, to rework that model so that it's much better at doing things like verification on that new population. And I think we have a good idea about how to do that. So that's one area, and it ties in with some of these issues. You know, I don't think, you never know if you've got everybody in your database. I mean, there can always be groups of people that you haven't been exposed to. And so it's unreasonable to expect an algorithm to be able to handle everything. What you want is rapid adaptation without labels. And I think that's a place that we can make a lot of headway. So that's the one off the top of my head.
So you express skepticism that a single benchmark or a single database could solve all these problems.
Right.
Now this isn't exactly the same, but we'll talk about developing certain definitions or tests for things like risk for intended use. In your opinion, what are the kinds of people, skills, collaborations, or consultations? What kind of process should we have for developing those definitions and tests as well?
Well, that's what we're trying to lay out. So we're writing this white paper. It's probably going to be about 100 pages. And we're just, you know, one of the most important things is just to create definitions that people can start to agree on. And it doesn't mean that everybody's going to agree with exactly how to apply them, but at least we can start saying, like, I think this is a low-risk application. Somebody else can say, I think it's a high-risk application. I'm not sure I'm answering your question. Can you?
It's the very definition of, you know, how we agree on and how we come up with that definition for what counts as low risk and what counts as high risk.
Right. Well, it takes a lot of work. I mean, so this whole thing I described about whether you corroborate something before you act on it. Like, if you're using a social media app and it says, this is a picture of this person's grandmother, well, there could be a rule that says you're not allowed to even put a label on it until you get another independent source of information. But that seems ridiculous, right? Because the negative consequences are very low for that. But if there are serious possible negative consequences from your action, then you should corroborate it. So that's something that's really emerged only after we've been working on this for a few months. Even though it seems obvious in retrospect, that's a key dividing line. Other things are like, so I really encourage people who are developing products to think about, you know, could they be happy limiting what this is for to a certain class of applications? And if not, then they need to start thinking about what are the differences between the procedures we should go through for low risk and higher risk applications. I mean, ultimately, it's common sense, but you can look at the FDA's model of like what are the regulations for class 2 and class 3 devices and see what people have to go through before they can market that kind of stuff. But we're trying to keep you from having to do that by laying a lot of the stuff out for you, at least an initial version, right? I mean, this is not going to get adopted as law the way it is. I also work on an ICCV committee that's trying to do standards for face recognition, but that's going so slowly that I don't think I think it's going to be years before that has any impact. Yeah.
There is also an entrepreneur in China saying that people sometimes are willing to trade off if they get a lot of conveniency by using face recognition. Maybe they can sacrifice some part of their privacy.
Sure.
How do you comment on this thing?
Well, I mean, every society, whether it's a city or a town or a state or a country, I mean, everybody has to make these. I don't want to make those decisions for people. I would like to lay out some definitions and some guidelines that people can use to make policy, and then governments will make the decisions about those trade-offs. Governments, I mean, basically governments. So I'm definitely not in the business of telling anybody what to do, but I think we can provide guidance for how to think about these problems. And then those trade-offs are, they're going to be handled differently in different places. I'm going to stay away from that, from prescribing that. Yeah.
Kind of the opposite of what I just asked. Is there anything that kind of worries you in the future in particular? Is there anything of concern with face recognition to you personally?
Well, I think, I mean, there are more and more cases every day of AI software that's being found to be hurting people in various ways. I mean, this is not a face recognition example, but there's just been an article in the last few weeks about how medical recommendations for certain groups of people in the U.S., basically people who are poor, have been advised not to go to the doctor because somebody trained an algorithm on these populations, and I can't remember exactly what I worked, but it was basically propagating a pre-existing difference in the populations. It's like black people don't go to the doctor much, so I'm going to recommend that they don't go to the doctor even when they're sick, which is totally preposterous, right? So there's a lot of this stuff out there, and I don't know, it doesn't keep me up at night or anything, but I think the main reason it doesn't keep me up at night is because there are people bringing this, getting this talked about in the media and so forth, which can, it can be aggravating at sometimes, but I think it's healthy, and I think people are starting to try to deal with it. So I'm not too worried until the singularity comes.
I think in general, I agree that technology itself does not improve negative things. It's how people use that. I like the idea you described to regulate the intention of the application, how we are using the software. I think this can lead to a very healthy community going forward and more different kind of technology improvement. One last question.
You talked a bit about data regulation. According to you, are these two different topics, algorithm regulation and data regulation?
Yeah, good question. So privacy and data regulation is a huge issue, and the way, as we're writing this white paper, we don't want to try to solve all the problems, so we have to figure out how to encapsulate it. And so the way I view privacy, which is not something that I'm a specialist in, is that it's a risk that when you sit down to try to identify the risks associated with your face recognition application, one of the risks you have to consider is we could be violating the GDPR, we could be violating somebody's privacy in a way that they don't appreciate. So I view it as a risk category, and then the vendor or the developer of the software has to make a convincing argument that they've thought through those issues. And presumably in an FDA for face recognition, you would have somebody who's expert in those issues looking at that section of the plan. It's like with a medical device, you have sterility. You have to convince people you've got a sterile device and it's going to be used in the OR, in the operating room. And so there's a sterility expert that looks at your application and says, they're a disaster, this isn't working. So it's one of these categories, and again, we're not trying to be prescriptive, but we want to see people definitely addressing that. Like, here's why it's not a concern, or here's why it is a concern, but we're addressing it. All right, well, thanks.
Okay,
for
yeah,
that.
that